The opinions and views expressed in the following presentation do not necessarily reflect those of GCR Progressive Internet Radio Management, staff, or our affiliates.
Toto? I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GCR Progressive Internet Radio. Fear rocking your world.
So nice and sharp. I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GCR Internet Radio. We're not going to do the usual, banter about what's going on, but I am going to ask for prayers for all the people out near Idlewild, California with those horrid fires. There are a lot of wildfires going on right now, and it's really getting dangerous. And this is what happens when we build houses in areas that are hit by lightning and very dry and that kind of thing. Please pray for everybody at Mother Nature's mercy right now. Extreme weather is hitting all over Europe. Third world countries, floods, earthquakes, you name it. Everybody's getting hammered. God bless you all. I love you all. And please say a prayer for everybody. Please remind everybody that animals need shelter. They're not, dogs shouldn't be tied to a tree and left until you remember they're there. Animals need protection from heat. Children need protection from heat. So do old people. Old people tend to think, 100 years ago, I used to sit outside, in 100-degree weather, and they can't do that anymore. So sometimes it's a little, hard to get them, to suck up and come in. I want to welcome all the people in the chat room. I want to welcome people that are listening on the players and will be listening to the recordings of this. God bless you all. Our guest, Jeff Mudgett, is on, and he has written a book called Bloodstains. Jeff has been on before. And we've talked about an ancestor of his. We can't pick our relatives, people. As much as I would like to, sometimes you can't. And he's got a dubious relationship to one of America's most prolific serial killers. And the more that gets unraveled, the more it seems that he did a lot more than just what we think he did. So, Jeff Mudgett, welcome back to the lair.
Hello.
Hello. Now I'm going to try to see if they're hearing you. Are you hearing him in the chat? Somebody let me know. Did you hear Jeff say hello?
Hello. 1, 2, 3.
No sound. Jeff, I think I'm going to have to reschedule because we're already 12 minutes into this. Oh, okay, wait. Yes, they can. Yes, they hear you. That's cool. Okay, so Jeff, let's just pick it up where you were. Your great-great-grandfather was?
My great-great-grandfather's real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but he was known historically as H.H. Holmes, perhaps the most evil man that ever lived, and the first killer to be classified as a serial killer by our criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. You were a young middle-aged when you found this out, and your poor grandfather kind of just blurted it out to you because you started asking questions, right, about this at the table during a dinner?
Yeah, roughly so. My grandmother was convinced we were the descendants of General Robert E. Lee. She had hired a genealogical company, quite expensive actually, and with some help from my brother had tracked that down only to find out that it wasn't true. The professionals tried to let her down easy, Mo, by stating that we were the descendants of a horse thief in Arkansas who had been executed by a rope. Well, at that same dinner table, the questions flew back and forth, and then my grandfather was forced to admit to the entire family that we were actually the descendants of H. Holmes, a secret he'd kept from even my grandmother, the woman he'd been married to for 60 years.
Yeah, 60 years ago, this was not something you wanted to share with the family and the kiddies, that great-great-grandpop was H. Holmes and had a murder castle in Chicago, and during the World's Fair in 1898 was killing people. It tends to make everybody think, what the hell, And the stigma. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer's family, for crying out loud, what they're going through. So I can't imagine how he just kept this to himself and hoped, I guess, you'd never find out.
Yeah, back then, Mo, the family, the stigma, you coined it exactly correct. Back then, people believed in the devil. I guess it's coming back around these days even, but back then, the turn of the century, the devil was believed in. There were many articles by the New York Times trying to characterize Holmes as the devil, an evil being different from most other human beings. My grandfather and the family moved west out to California to escape that stigma, and he'd done a pretty good job running away from the truth of what actually happened in the 1890s, as you described it. So he had done a good job. It was only after this obsession my grandmother had about, the general from Civil War fame, that it all came out. And he stood up. I describe it in the book, Mo. He stood up at the table. I can still see it clear as the day. He slammed his chair back against the wall. His eyes went around the table, and he said, "That name will never be mentioned in my house again." Then he pointed his finger at me and stormed out of the room.
Yeah, I remember that in the book. And then when your grandfather died, somehow you became in possession of a box that belonged to him, and there were artifacts in this box which opened up Pandora's box for you, I'm sure. And I guess anybody who wants to read the book, it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. I mean, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, to have this kind of thing in their family, because I just think it's really rough. But you can find Bloodstains on Amazon, and Jeff has a site, right? What's your site, Jeff?
Yeah, bloodstainsthebook.com, all one word, and you can buy a printed signed copy there. Just let my manager Kelly know that you heard about the book on the show tonight. Mo's a friend of mine, and I'll instruct Kelly to give out signed copies with the order if you'd like.
Oh, thank you so much. The book, you got a box of information, and when I delve into this like I do for each show, I research and all, a lot of people are questioning where is the evidence, because when we were talking last time, I told you that if Mudget had survived and was not executed, H. Holmes was not executed, there's a very good chance he was involved in the Chicago torso murders, because the idea was the same thing. The only thing is you're talking about a man 70 or older who can't schlep bodies anymore, so he was just dumping them out, where it was convenient. But a lot of people are asking, where is your information? Because you and I both have some questions about him being Jack the Ripper.
That's exactly true. And Mo, let me state to those questioning my story, Bloodstains is a piece of fiction based on the truth that I decided to characterize that way after many meetings with my lawyers. The readers can believe in it or not. I intend to prove almost everything in it eventually. We're going to prove that he was Jack the Ripper. That's coming up pretty soon. We're going to prove that he was never hanged, that the guard was hanged in his place. We're going to prove that his DNA is not in that concrete buried in Pennsylvania. And then we're going to prove to the world where he actually is buried. So if people want to believe that I made that up all myself and then proved it historically, well, they can if they want. But the story is about the material my grandfather left me after he died in a couple of old fishing tackle boxes, and I describe that in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are actually letters or writings from your great-great-grandfather, right, that were in the book.
That's what the story is about, Mo, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you got to help me out here. You got to tell them what you want them to know so they buy the book and read it. Jack the Ripper, let's talk about Holmes just for a minute. I know we blew 12 minutes when Skype insisted I update, and they're going to get a scathing email from me about that. But he was an entrepreneur. This guy, he found unique ways of making money. He was a grifter, and he started out selling insurance and collecting on fraud insurance, and then selling bodies to medical places, and then he just excelled and kept going and became a mass murderer, a serial killer. You can't take it away from the guy. He was an entrepreneur of the first class, right?
Absolutely, Mo. You've hit it on the nail on the head. He had one of the highest IQs ever recorded at the University of Michigan Medical School. He paid for his tuition, Mo, by selling skeletons to medical schools and universities around the country. He then went on to make life insurance fraud almost an everyday event for him. Here's a man before the turn of the century who was making $300,000 or $400,000 a year. I don't know what that translates into today's dollars, but obviously $10, $20, $30 million probably. But he would kill the husband, have the wife seduce the wife. She would fall in love with him, and then change her life insurance proceeds for him, and then she would disappear rather quickly after the entire episode was completed. So he was incredibly wealthy. He was incredibly intelligent. He was purely psychopathic, and like I describe in the book, Mo, I don't think it's any exaggeration whatsoever. Perhaps the most evil man who ever lived. And we're going to do History Channel is doing a show next Friday on the 26th called The Haunted History, where they follow me down, their 3 film crews, into the basement at 63rd and Wallace in Chicago where the murder castle was. And they reenact chapter 27 in the book, that chapter, and you remember it, Mo, where I described going down into the basement of that post office and hearing the voices, seeing the vision. And they try to reenact it, and I can't wait to see. It's a full hour, and they're going to do it next Friday, July 26th.
There is a common wall that still stands, or a partial piece of a common wall that still stands from the original castle. It's my understanding, right?
Yeah, there's quite a debate over the basement of the post office and the basement of the murder castle. There were some changes on the street alignments. Obviously, the post office was not built directly over the top of where the murder castle basement was. There is some overlap. There is some original tunnels still there, the original brick that Holmes invented as an escape route if the police ever came down into his lobby. The mistake the professionals and experts make, Mo, and I get a chuckle over this every time I hear it, is they assume that his basement for the murder castle was the exact lines of the building outside above ground, and it wasn't. It overflowed had a much higher square footage than did the floors over the top of it. So when they argue with me about the placement of the basement, I ask them for their drawings and their exact locations for the four corners of that basement, and none can come up with it. So, I try to explain that on the show next week for History Channel, and I think I do a pretty good job of explaining why there is a definite overlap, and part of the horror and the torture that occurred is below that post office today.
Right. Elf is asking in the chat, we have a few people listening by way of chat room, and she's asking what corner. Can you give the location where the murder castle was?
Yeah, it's in Inglewood, which is a rough section of Chicago. If you go there during the day, go there 4 or 5 people, don't go there by yourself. It's at 63rd and Wallace. It's an easy drive from downtown Chicago, about 30 minutes, and you'll see this 1930-ish post office, all barricaded windows with cameras facing every angle that you can approach it from, on a very high-speed highway there next to it, with an overpass from the bridge, with the same bridge tunnel system that was there in 1937 when the federal government bought the murder castle and tore it to the ground and built the post office over the top of it. So go out to 63rd and Wallace, and you'll see what it is today, exactly as it was in 1937 when the murder castle was torn down.
There are actually pictures of it on the internet, the murder castle. If you Google H.H. Holmes and murder castle, you will see actual pictures of what was there before the post office. He tried to set fire to it when he was finally going to lose it. He decided to try to collect insurance on it, and that kind of became his undoing because that raised suspicions, and then things started really falling apart for him. And eventually the building was razed, but I can't even imagine what the police thought and the firefighters when they got into this building and saw. The man was a genius. He would hire people to work on a part of the building, then fire him and hire a new crew, right?
Exactly correct. He knew if there ever was a picture of what premeditated looks like, Mo, it would be a face of H.H. Holmes. This man planned this building out 2 years in preparation for the World's Fair because he knew the millions of visitors from all over the world, unaccounted for visitors, would be coming by the junction where he built the murder castle. He knew they'd have to get off trains and change. And that night, before they went to the World's Fair that day, after traveling all day for weeks maybe, they'd need a place to stay. And he prepped that building so that he could select the finest specimens for his experiments and torture.
Right. And we're not gonna go to a commercial because we did have that technical problem with Skype earlier. He ended up being, according to law enforcement, he was taken to Philadelphia. He was executed May 7th, 1896. You don't think it was him because he was capable of hypnotizing people. But he also had some money still stashed around. I think if he got out of it, he bought his way out of it. Maybe paid somebody on death row to take his place, whatever, and that. But when they buried him, they put like cement over his grave?
Yeah, man, you're close. My theories are a little bit different. He did buy his way out of much of it, but when the body came off the gallows, he had hired Pinkerton guards to immediately stand by over it. The body was laid into a casket, Mo, and then filled with concrete immediately. There was no autopsy. Mm-hmm. He paid his way out of an autopsy, which was unheard of in Philadelphia law. Then a mule team dragged it out to the cemetery where it was put down in the hole, and that was filled with concrete, which when you think of it, if you know anything about this man's mind and how it worked, Mo, he could have cared less about what happened to his hydrocarbons and his body after he was executed. He wouldn't have cared. He did it because he knew if it was exhumed and they found out it wasn't him in that hole, there would be the greatest manhunt since Abraham Lincoln's assassination. They would have found him and they would have shot him on sight. He knew that, so he planned it from the start.
Yeah, and if we go with the idea, which that whole thing just reeks, it just stinks. When you think of all this, how does somebody buy their way out of being displayed? Which I'm sure was a fear of his, because they did it with all the big gunslingers of the day. They would take their body and prop it up and then travel it around the place. Poor President Lincoln, what they did to that poor schmuck. So, instead of just taking him and burying him, they traveled all over the place with him, showing the body and all that. So, yeah, there's a fear of that, but the whole thing with putting, stuff, concrete in it. So your idea is that during the building of this murder castle, he went over to England. And you think he was the Ripper, and why do you think that?
Yeah, and let me correct a couple of the facts you laid out. He bought the property in July of 1888, all right? The construction of the murder castle, didn't start until the spring of 89, and that's one of the big mistakes the other authors and quote-unquote experts make about their argument that he couldn't have been Jack the Ripper. He was building the murder castle at the same time. Well, that's just wrong. He didn't start until the spring of 89, and we can probably prove that precisely. I also asked for these experts to bring forth one piece of evidence establishing either a photo or a document with a signature on it that he was in Chicago from that July period until the spring of 89. Not one has come forth yet, Mo. So when I put the facts together, and I used to practice law in California. When I put the circumstantial evidence together and we start working it out piece by piece, it's a jigsaw puzzle. I don't know if it'll ever be directly proven, absolutely. I don't know if it ever will be. Right. But we now have professional detectives, even Scotland Yard, scratching their heads saying, you know what? This starts to make sense. We have a computer schematic of the 13 eyewitnesses. See, most people don't realize this, Mo. There were 13 eyewitnesses of what Jack the Ripper looked like that Scotland Yard had in their possession. In 2006, they and the BBC ran those eyewitness accounts through their computer system they used to create composites of serial killers. I put that on my home page on the bloodstainsthebook.com page. I had my professional lay a photo of H.H. Holmes over the top of it. I hired an expert at comparing composites with photographs, a man in Virginia, a detective, who said this was the closest he ever saw in his entire career, the nose, the ears, the eyes. Amazing stuff. At the bottom of that same page, we ran comparisons, Mo, about the handwriting you were talking about earlier, with the Dear Boss and the From Hell letters. We had experts from the British Library stating there's no doubt it's the same hand. Well, as you know, Mo, whoever wrote Dear Boss and From Hell doesn't prove that they were Jack the Ripper. It proves they wrote those two letters, all right? But we had British detectives tell me the knowledge of those two letters is greater than what was being distributed about by the media in London in 1888. There's a knowledge there that goes beyond common knowledge. So I knew that expert testimony of handwriting was questionable. The Supreme Court has even thrown it out 15 years ago. But we knew that the Department of Justice, and the Post Office had hired a company at the University of Buffalo to create a computer program comparing handwriting. We asked them to help. They jumped all over it. and they came back with a 97.95% similarity between Holmes's handwriting and those two Ripper letters. All right, to put that into perspective, Mo, if I had you write two letters right now, on two separate pages, and we ran your two letters you wrote right now through that computer program, you probably wouldn't get 97.95. That's how close it is.
You probably couldn't read it. That's how bad my handwriting is now. But let me ask you something, okay? Because the only way we can absolutely prove any of this is to exhume the body, and they won't let you do that, will they?
No, they will. It's just a lot of money, Mo. I went through, I put it all out, hired some professionals to help me, what it would be to get court orders, all that stuff. Because I'm a relative, I can do it. Exhume the concrete. We had the Smithsonian say they wanted to jump in and take possession of the remains. It was a national, they didn't say monument, but it was a historical piece of United States evidence. They would supervise the comparison of my tissue with the remains from the concrete, which I thought was great because somebody like the Smithsonian supervising it, it takes it out of the Geraldo Rivera fraud stuff, Mo.
Right, yeah.
And when we put it all together, Mo, we reached a budget of close to $100,000. So all of your listeners, when they help me out buying books, that's where most of our profits are going to, a fund that one day will be enough for us to exhume that concrete and do the DNA comparison and prove to the world that it wasn't Holmes that was hanged that day, it was his prison guard, and that thing that the New York Times wrote about for years after, that Holmes curse, where people died that were involved in his arrest, his trial, and the supposed execution, up to 40 of them. We can now state, well, one day we'll be able to state there was no such thing as a supernatural curse. It was Holmes revisiting those people that had irritated him.
Right. The Smithsonian won't fund any of this? They want the body, but they won't help pay for it?
They haven't offered to yet. I haven't asked them formally. It's something that I've been trying to pursue myself with the proceeds from the book, because it's something I think I owe people of our country that with the money for the sales going to that, rewriting history, and I think it's something that needs to be done.
Well, let me dive into this, because I've been poring over this. I've read the book. I did research when I first met you. Then I've been doing it right along now. Let's talk about Holmes. He was a methodical man. He liked the game. If you'll forgive me for saying this, and I hope I don't upset anybody who's lost a loved one to violence, but in cases like Holmes, they enjoy the entire game. He liked picking the victim, seeing the young lady at the train saying, "Oh, miss, let me help you with that suitcase." And then, "Are you here for the World's Fair?" "Oh, you're a secretary. I'm looking for a secretary." He liked drawing them in like a fish, and then getting their confidence. And for the first few weeks, they thought, "Oh my God, I just met, God. He's such a wonderful person." He loved the entire game from first concept to whatever he did with their remains. Jack the Ripper didn't do that. Do you think if he was Jack the Ripper and did that, what was the satisfaction out of it? Because it was wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
Well, as I explain in the chapter, I worked through the contentions you have. I think I came up with a plausible scenario what he was doing in London, and it was only because Scott Lanyard helped me out. When I gave them my evidence and we discussed how the first 3 Ripper killings were different from the last 2 or last 3, Mo, they told me for decades they had believed that the last 2 or 3 were a copycat killer, and they used the pathology reports prove their point. In those pathologies, the doctors went on and on about the first 2 Ripper killings having been done by an expert surgeon who could remove organs without damaging bordering organs in the 4 or 5 minutes time they think those Ripper killings occurred in. The last 2 were done by slashings, people that Scotland Yard does not believe is the same killer. Now, when you start using that scenario, that MO, that it has to be an expert surgeon, of the 100 plausible suspects, Mo, you're down to 2. And Holmes is one of them. And when you realize his MO at home in Chicago with the murder castle, how he did that after his medical school career, the murders he committed before that I think I can establish, that's a man who could have removed those female organs from the victims. Now, he wrote about being fascinated with the hormonal science. He wanted to learn. He was a Frankenstein. He wanted to learn how to live forever. And he knew it had to do with the hormones established in the female reproductive system. When you go to those first 2 Ripper killings, Mo, when you read those pathologies, and you can get them on Google right now, you'll see that those are the same organs he was fascinated with here in the United States.
Yeah, and we only have 10 minutes left, and the thing with him is this was while the murder castle was being built. Perhaps he was practicing the skills he needed in case he got caught short, or something like that. It's a different Holmes than the one we see at the castle, absolutely. So this would have been before the castle, right? Before he started luring him into the castle, right?
Yeah, 6 or 7. Oh, before the castle was completed, 2 years probably, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe this was his training type of ground, and that the letters, when you read them, they are definitely a attempt to sound like a uneducated common man in Victorian England. The language used, it's almost comic the way the letters read, because it's such an attempt to make it sound like it's somebody, not learned. And do you think he would do that? Because my thinking is, if H.H. Holmes were asked, what do you think about Jack the Ripper? I think he'd turn around and call him a bloody amateur. Making a mess of everything. He's an amateur. That's not how you do it, But that's me. It's just, what do you think is going to happen? We're never going to prove it, but what do you think is going to happen with this?
Well, and I think it's brilliant what you just brought out. Many of the Ripperologists and professional detectives believe that those 2 letters were written by an American, and a very intelligent American trying to sound English. So you nailed that one. That was very good. Now, as far as us never proving that, I have one hope. And I explain this, I hope the History Channel brings it forth on the 26th. When we were down in the basement of the post office, I showed them where there had been a hole cut in the wall where the 2 basements bordered each other, all right? That hole in the wall was the size of a doorway. I sent the FOIA request into the federal government and received 2 letters back that are just redacted all out to where you can't understand anything, which when you think of it, Mo, is pretty strange for something 70 or 80 years ago that doesn't have to do with nuclear weapons involving Russia, right? Here we have a post office in Englewood, Chicago. It's not a national security issue. So why they wouldn't give me the full documents, I have no idea. It is my belief that was once dug through that wall, cut through, and then they excavated into the evidence which will still exist in the ground where the murder castle was. And I think one day when that post office is closed, Mo, people like you are going to be able to help me have that scientifically excavated, and we might find one day, maybe, some direct evidence about Holmes being Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, they're asking in the chat, and we only have 7 minutes because Jeff has to go to the theater in a little bit, and then we'll talk about it more in the show, and hopefully some people will call in and join me and talk about it. But the thing is that he was planning this for a long time. The guy was constantly trying to become rich. That's one thing that is common right through everything. He wanted money, he needed money, he liked to associate with rich people and that kind of thing. But while the castle was being built, he was practicing, but obviously he wasn't practicing in Chicago, because by the time it was built, there would have been somebody saying, hey, there's a lot of people missing. He had to wait for that influx of blank faces that no one would ever miss again, right?
That's a tough one, because none of us can I don't know, accurately surmise what was happening back then. I know Chicago was still largely an old West town full of chaos. And the police were, they couldn't handle the entire situation. There were criminals left and right. There were people trying to make a dollar left and right. And Holmes was so smart that he would have been well off doing the things you just described about not killing at the site of his construction. Now, there are some experts in Chicago who tell me that he had a glass factory over by the river that never sold glass. Now, you tell me why, Mo, a man like him would have had the ability to have heat, so much heat that he could create glass and sand. He used to buy the sand to do it, only never to sell the glass. To me, that looks like waste, human waste after murders, and those type of contentions or arguments. So I can't prove those things. I think one day it might be proven, but I think like shows like yours, they're helping me explain to your listeners that this man for 100 years, Mo, we didn't really know much about him. Finally, with the movies being made by Warner Brothers with Leonardo DiCaprio, now I have a big studio buying my book that's going to make a movie about Bloodstains. We finally have interested people with a lot of money who are going to try to explain to people like your listeners that this man needs to be studied more than we ever have before, because he was one of a kind, truly unique.
I'm telling you, Robert Downey Jr. would be wonderful as Mudgett. He's about the same height. He's the dark hair, the dark eyes, and he's got wonderful body language. Mudgett was a not bad-looking guy. From all the accounts I've read, he wasn't a big, huge man, but he was sturdy built. He had a nice build. He had a pleasant-looking face. Women were charmed by him all the time. It wasn't easy for him to get what he wanted, and they were asking in the chat, this was a lifelong obsession with him when he was a young man, and after Jeff leaves, I'll delve into this a little bit more, but when he was a young man, some schoolmates tried to scare him by bringing him in with a skeleton, and instead of being frightened, he became fascinated with physiology, right?
Oh, he was fascinated from the when you and I were riding bikes and playing with balls.
Right.
He was interested in physiology and cadavers, digging up graves. That's how he started out as a young boy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have to remember something. It was a time when somebody passed away, they were laid out in your parlor, and young children would go to bed, give Grandma a kiss goodnight, and Grandma's in the box in the parlor, and they're going to bed at night, and coming down in the morning for their breakfast, and they pass Grandma's coffin until, the next day when she's going to be buried. It was a different time back then, so nobody at the time must have thought it was odd that he was fascinated by it, because it was all part of life to see dead bodies in your parlor in a coffin in a casket or laid out. If you want to see really weird stuff, look at Victorian pictures of dead people that were laid out so their families could see them. It's a fascinating story. It's just one of those mysteries that you can't get out of. I don't know. How do you do it? Because if it were my family member, I think I would be exhausted by now.
You know what, Mo, and I'm glad you brought that up because I want to explain that to your listeners. My readers are not given a nonfiction piece of work about the facts, how Holmes killed a body, okay? My story is about finding out that this was my direct descendant. I ask my readers to step into my shoes and then go on to explore who they are as people after finding out that this evil thing was a part of my DNA, my genesis, okay? And that description of how I came to identify who I was as a man is what Bloodstains is about. So I try to tell all my prospective readers, if you want to read about how he killed 27 people, go to The Devil in the White City, go to the other books about Holmes. If you want to feel how your life would change learning something like this with the snap of a finger, that's what Bloodstains is about. And quite frankly, that's what the movie people want to make the movie about. So I'm quite thrilled about that.
Yeah, it's the bloodstains are on you, and you've got to learn to live with them now. And it's no worse than any other person finding out, oh my God, my grandfather was a Nazi during World War II, or, oh my God, I'm related to Jeffrey Dahmer, or the other one that dressed like a clown, Gacy. I mean, it's a life-changing thing, and you sit there and wonder, well, I don't act like that. I wonder, what is the story? And it's got to be found out because you have children, right?
Yeah, and you know what, Mo? I instead of running away from the truth, I decided, I knew I was different, all right? I knew I had idiosyncrasies about me that related to something different, something unique. And it wasn't good stuff, the thoughts that I had. When I learned this, and I went on my obsession to find out the real facts about this thing, that knowledge has made my life better. I'm a better man now because of my knowledge, and I think those are things that people that want to read my book should realize. Having the truth, even if it's bad, can make you a better person. I firmly believe that.
Yeah. I'm going to let you go because I promised I would let you go at 9:50, and it's 9:51, so beat me up for being a liar. Thank you so much for coming on. I will plug the book again as we talk about it during the night, and hopefully I can get some of my cohorts in to continue this discussion. God bless you, and enjoy the play. What are you going to see?
Fiddler on the Roof with my daughter. She works on some plays in L.A., and she's been looking forward to see this for a long time. But I tell you what, Mo, I've enjoyed the show. Thank you very much. Let your listeners know that I can use all the help I can get about digging up that concrete and doing the DNA comparisons, because I'd like to be the one that rewrites history. Having been a family member, I think there's something unique about that. So if every sale we make on shows like yours, and like I say, I'll have my manager send a signed one to your listeners. But they help me out put that fund together. That one day we'll do the right thing and tell the truth to the world. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, well, God bless you. Enjoy the play, and I hope you have a nice summer, and come back on when this movie thing gets into full swing. By all means, you're going to be like the 5th author I've had that's had a movie or something, or a movie of the week made out of their book. So I'm excited to see this happen. Good night, and thanks so much. All you got to do is hang up.
Thanks a lot, Mo.
Okay, night-night. That was very interested. No, Fiddlers in the Roof he's going to see. We're going to go to break now, and I'm going to play Scott Joplin. What a lot of people don't know is Scott Joplin was not a well-known musician during the Chicago World's Fair, but he was hired to play there. And he did play his song Maple Leaf Rag, even though it had not been published yet. So I'm going to play that, and we'll be right back.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Well, hello there. This is Stan, inviting you to listen to Jurassic Park, where we dig up the old bones of rock and roll, 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, and then carefully rebury them. Thursday nights, 8 Eastern, on GCR.
You might recognize that last bit if you watch Ripper Street, which is a BBC American show about Jack the Ripper. But we played Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag because he played at the World's Fair in Chicago during the time that the Murder Castle was there. And I just love that piece because it brings you right back to that time. Tin Pan Alley, that type of thing. It always brings me right into that mood. And there is a show called Ripper Street on BBC America that is phenomenal. It's a little rough to watch, but it's about the Ripper murders and that. If anybody wants to join me, let me know, and I'll just bring you in on the conversation, and we can have like a round table, which I would really appreciate. But the thing with H.H. Holmes is the book that Jeff has written is his search to find out who his great-great-grandfather was. And that's the hard thing, trying to figure out who this man was, because you're sitting at your table during dinner and your mother is blissfully yakking away saying, and we're related to General Lee, and we come from the finest stock in the South, and she's going on and on and on, and the old man is starting to turn red, and then finally you got the one son say, well, I went to the library, and you know what, that H.H. Holmes, his last name was actually Mudgett, and that kind of was the catalyst for this book. Jeff's father, Jeff started asking questions about the, Mudgett, Robert Mudgett being related to them, and the mother is sitting there saying no, 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 and his father just literally explodes and says, don't ever mention that name again, and that's a hell of a way to find out that your great-grandfather is a, serial killer. The introduction to the book says there are no vampires between these pages, or werewolves or mummies. They are not needed. Bloodstains is the story of a real monster, my great-great-grandfather, Herman Webster Mudgett. History knows him as the infamous serial killer, Dr. H.H. Holmes, perhaps the most evil man who ever roamed this planet. And you will come to know him as the wickedness personified. His blood stains my soul. And when I think of somebody finding this kind of thing out, I mean, we all think, oh, Jeffrey Dahmer is old stuff. But imagine somebody being related to that family finding out in another 20 years, and somebody says, well, we're related to Jeffrey Dahmer, or we were related to John Wayne Gacy. And it's actually something that probably a lot of families might not survive. So I can understand his grandfather never telling anybody about it. Kind of mystery to me is why, if he didn't want anybody to know about it, why he kept his grandfather's stuff around, or his father's stuff around, and then handed them off to Jeff. That's a little bit odd. But to go back in the conversation, Ghost was saying, well, he must have been planning this all his life. Yeah, he was fascinated with human anatomy as a child. He would, look at bodies, and that he wasn't, nobody said that he cut anything up. Nobody ever witnessed him cutting up frogs or young animals. But now that you look back, you kind of think at some point this guy must have been doing it. Nailing frogs to boards to see how long it takes them to die and stuff like that. And then he marries a young lady, and if you go with the history, not Jeff's book, history and Jeff's book are two different things. He's telling the story of his search and what he's uncovering, but he's also making it fictional so that he can't get sued by people. Then you've got real history that says he met this young rich socialite, married her. They went to Chicago or whatever, Michigan, to go to school. He became a doctor. He wanted to go to be a doctor. She was helping him, but then he ended up strapped for money. And so what he did was he met a young man that was right across the table from him, his autopsy partner, the partner who took apart cadavers. And they got friendly because you're working head to head dissecting these bodies in medical school, and he found out that medical schools would pay money for cadavers and skeletons. These schools needed them. You can thank H.H. Holmes for medical schools being a lot more, you have to remove the HTTP, Stanley in chat, if you put a link up there so it'll work. If you think about it, now medical schools, those kind of medical supply houses, they have to answer for where they get all their stuff now. Back in the day, that was not the case. It was an underground, dirty business. It took place in the dark at night. All the old horror movies, the two guys from England that used to rob graves. Nobody wanted to know Aunt Em was dug up and used for a cadaver, but that's what they would do back then. Burke and Hare, thank you, Ghost. They would go into a cemetery after after a burial, and they would dig up the body, take it out of the coffin, put the coffin back, cover the dirt up, and then sell it to a medical house. And the deal was that a lot of medical schools didn't want. There was two rules. No signs of the person being killed, procured by being killed, by racking them in the head. So you didn't want a corpse with like a scarring on the head or a smashed in skull, because then they would ask you, well, where did you get this? That kind of thing. So you went through the cemetery, and when somebody died of something, you waited until after the funeral, you dug them up, you got them out of the coffin, put the coffin back, and then you just covered it up. And of course, unless somebody decides to dig it up, nobody's going to see it. What he started doing is, as he ran out of bodies, he started giving them laudanum. And laudanum is an opiate. And the thing is, in a large amount, it'll stop your heart. So he would give people a drink and then lace it with laudanum, and eventually by the end of the night, they would just fall asleep and die. And that's how he was getting bodies for a long time. Then he started getting into an idea of how to make even more money. Yeah, grave robbing. And then he started getting into an idea of getting more money. He would take businessmen and he would lock them up in rooms and things like that and starve them until they gave him what he was looking for, and then of course they would disappear. In the murder mansion castle, what we were talking about earlier was he would hire people to work on this building, and the first work crew would be fired and never allowed back on the premises. And then he'd have a second group who would be doing more work, but they had no idea what the first group was doing. So they went in, these are the plans you're working on, this is what you do. And then he'd fire them. And this is how that entire thing was built. So when he set fire to it after he started losing his shirt and creditors were demanding to be paid, he would he did some unique things too. One creditor wanted to take all the furniture back towards the end, and all like the little dishes and pottery and all of that. When they went into the murder house, they couldn't find it. And when they went outside, they said there's nothing in it. And the guard at the door from the court says, well, nothing came out, so it's got to be in there. And they'd go back in and say, no, it's not. What he did was he had everything moved into a room. Then he closed the door, boarded over it, papered that, so no one saw that there had ever been a door there. And eventually what one guy did, an insurance company guy, he kicked a hole in his anger through a wall, and that's when they realized there was a room in there, and they found all the stuff. But Mudget, instead of being charged with all the stuff, trying to hide the stuff, he sued them for damaging his wall. And when it went to court, it was just dismissed, tit for tat. You got your furniture eventually. No, you can't sue them. But that's the kind of guy he was. He was pretty resourceful when you think about the stuff he did. But it's kind of intriguing that now I've always considered him a prime suspect if he did not get executed on May 7th in 96. I've always thought, and I told Jeff the last time he was on, that the Cleveland torso killings were right up his alley. And if you look that up, in the 1930s, at least 12 victims in Cleveland. Most of them were homeless people. They lived in the shanty part of the town. It was where, it was during the Depression. You had lost men. If anybody's ever seen the movie My Man Godfrey, forgotten men lived by the dumps, and they put up cardboard shacks, and that's where they were living, and families ended up living in there as the Depression went on. And so a predator was going through these areas and somehow getting these people to go with them. And the only reason anybody put two and two together is one body was not covered enough by dirt. And when they were doing street work, what this predator would do is he would find somebody doing road work and wait until they were starting to fill it up. They would take the break for a night. He would dump the body in, cover it with dirt, and when the guys came to work the next day, they would just fill in the rest of the hole, and nobody would know there was a body there, except something had happened, there was rain or something, and one of the bodies became visible. And then they started, what's going on? And then suddenly somebody said, Soup Kitchen started reporting some regulars were missing. They know of 12, but they think it could easily be 100 or more. That makes sense to me, and the reason it makes sense to me that he might have been the same person is because he would have been around 70, maybe 72. You're talking about a man who might not be physically able to get rid of the bodies as easily as he did when he was 38 and 40. So, and you're talking about somebody who probably didn't have the money and the means to build a castle again like he did. So those murders, I have always thought, if Jeff can prove that Mudgett was not executed, and in fact he paid somebody to do it for him, somebody else on death row who had nothing to lose, look, you take my place and I'll give your family $2,000. and somebody working there saying, all right, you let this slide and don't say nothing, and I'll give you $500 and your family $500. That's how you buy your way out of death row. And so if you think that there's a chance he did not die on death row in Philadelphia, and the reason he was put there was they started tracking the fraud, and then they started looking for children that was supposed to be in his care, and they started going to places he stayed, and they found the bodies of 3 children, 2 girls buried in a basement of a house he rented, and then in, I think, Canada, they found the remains of a boy in a house he rented in the fireplace. They found the teeth and bones. So that's why they brought him back to Philadelphia and put him on trial. And eventually they really nailed him for that, for killing the children. And really, that's when everybody started tracing him back. Up till then, nobody was looking at all the other stuff. It was still all, wow, there's some serial killer out, or whatever. Nobody knew exactly what he was up to, and they didn't know he was behind the murder castle, because he used a lot of aliases. It's an interesting and intriguing thing, and Jeff says there's enough proof for him that he thinks that during the building, which you have to remember back then in the winter, all the building would stop for, that kind of construction. Inclement weather, they would stop, that kind of thing. So in September, he goes to England, and all of a sudden these murders start happening. The only thing that bothers me is that I don't think he would have gotten the kind of gratification out of it that he would get later. But then you have to think, if it was before, maybe this guy, maybe he was just practicing and getting his himself ready for it. As far as I know, there are some passenger lists that he is suspected to be on, but he used like 30 different aliases. So this is a long, ongoing case that only started a couple of years ago. Jeff hasn't been researching this for like 20 years. This is one of these things that's ongoing. I'm going to go to another break because I have a lot of music for us tonight, because I don't want to just sit and talk for an hour. But I picked songs that we could, like Rattlin' Bones by Casey Chambers, Judas Priest, The Ripper, and then I got a little silly, Queen, Somebody You Love, because he did fall in love with at least one of his victims from the murder castle. And My Name is Jack, Dear Boss. It's a letter. It's actually a song. Somebody's reading the letter to music, kind of. And then I thought I'd get really silly, and I found this thing with Christopher Lee singing Captain Amazing Returns or something like that. It's a movie from the 70s, and he plays this arch-villain who's trying to make Alan Arkin become an alcoholic again, so it's really funny. Bobby Darin, Mac the Knife, that's a good song for a slasher movie. Taylor Dane, Original Sin, that's a good slasher, somebody who just really likes sin. AC/DC, Hell's Bells. So I'm going to take breaks in between and see if I can coax Carl or Stan to get in here and talk with me. That should be fun.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
This is Mo inviting you to visit me at my lair. Mo Banshee's Lair Visionary Talk Radio airs every Tuesday night live on GCRInternetradio.com. Tune in at 9 p.m. Eastern Time Zone. Topics A to Z, Mo Banshee's Lair on GCR Internet Radio. We're rocking your world.
Just try to stay out of my way. try. I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
That's the Judas Priest, The Ripper. And the other song was Casey Chambers' Rattlin' Bones, which I thought was kind of cute when I heard it. I mean, it's an old song, Rattlin' Bones, but it's a kickback to like Louis Armstrong and that kind of thing. And then they played it, and I thought it was kind of cute, really. We're talking about Bloodstains, a book by Jeff Mudgett, who, as it turns out, has the dubious honor of being the direct descendant of H.H. Holmes. It's kind of very interesting because it is Leon DiCaprio has been anxious to make a movie on this based on another book that was out. There's been a lot. If you look on YouTube, there's a lot of History Channel stuff. You know, it's very clinical. They're not talking about the impact on the family. It's not talking about, you know, a poor man standing up and hitting his fists on a table and a chair, going so hard behind him into a wall that it breaks pictures off the walls. And that's the facts of it. You know, we read it and go, oh my God, this guy was really screwed up, but this guy left a family. Before he was incarcerated, there is evidence that he went back to his very first wife, whom he had abandoned. He was going to divorce her, not because she did anything wrong, but because he was tired of her, and he had a son with her. And he was going to divorce her, but he never signed the papers. So the marriages after that were bigamists. You know, they weren't lawful. But he went back and he bought clothes for the kid and gave her some money and that kind of thing. So I think at the end he knew that his life as he knew it was over. Everything was coming up to him. All the fraud was coming back because there was no way of him getting money. Back in the day, before the castle, you were able to get a corpse and sell it for $10, $5 to a medical school, or you would take it. What he would take is he had a couple of different vats in his basement. Okay, thank you, Stanley. And he would debone the body, throw the bones in this chlorine, bleach them, and then he paid a friend of his to put them together in the way that you see skeletons hanging. Then he would take the skeleton of whomever he had just killed, who was usually a young lady that thought he was their knight in shining armor, or somebody he was swindling, and he would take that skeleton and sell it to the medical school. But once the murder castle had been found out, that was done. Then all the medical schools were on alert. Where are people getting these bodies from? So that was a problem. He couldn't get money that way. So he did turn before and after to insuring people, taking out large sums of money. Then he would kill somebody and say, oh, this is them, yes, this is them, and split the money with whomever he said it was. But eventually, he ended up running out of volunteers for that, and he started killing the people that were going in on it because he couldn't find people that looked like him. One of his partners, he couldn't find somebody who looked like him, so what he did was he killed him and took the body. You know, they put it someplace, they found it. Then they called him as being his friend and the widow's best friend. And he'd go and say, oh my God, it's them. Yeah, it's him, it's him. But then the widow ended up losing her kids. He to secure her not talking, to make sure she wouldn't talk, he took the kids with him. And he would say, they're fine, but eventually killing the kids was what sealed it for him, and he ended up in jail. And, you know, if you look at the pictures of him, he kind of reminds you, the look on him from his mugshot always reminds me of Tim Conway from McHale's Navy. You know how he does those comedy skits with the mustache and all, and he's got that dumb look on his face. He was a good-looking guy, but at that point, I don't think he believed he got caught. He was actually reported to trying to hypnotize the judge so he could get out of it, and the judge wouldn't let him try to hypnotize him. And then on his way to the Philadelphia prison, Eastern Penn, he actually tried to hypnotize the guards on him to see if he could get away that way, but they wouldn't do it. By all accounts, he was a proper inmate. He never did anything wrong. He was very calm and mannerly. Every day the one guard would bring him a newspaper so he could read the latest news about himself. He was really getting high on his own story, so that's kind of odd about him. But when you talk about, and I want to get into that Ripper bit, the only problem I'm having with it is Holmes enjoyed the whole game. And like I said earlier, he liked finding the victim, going to the train station, watching all the young ladies, and then finding the perfect one, the one he liked. He liked chatting her up, getting her back to his hotel, wine-dine her. She's sending notes home to her families. Oh, Mr. Holmes is just so lovely. Mr. Holmes is like a second father to me. Mr. Holmes says you never have to worry about me again. And then suddenly she's gone. And he's either got her down in his torture chamber and using her for whatever he wants to use it for. Now, there's two rules here. Some people think he didn't get any sexual satisfaction from it. And then, of course, there's always the thing that he enjoyed. He got off on having complete control of a human being, and a very pretty girl to boot, you know. I just don't see that kind of game with Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was an opportunist who walked the streets at night, and you're talking about, and this is before the castle. We have to keep it chronologically intact. Jack the Ripper was before the murder castle was complete. So you can argue that he was honing his skills. You can argue that he was doing a little extracurricular, whatever you want to argue. But still, I don't see how he got the satisfaction of taking someone who was missing teeth, and back then a prostitute who was 45 years old in Whitechapel looked like an 89-year-old woman today. It was a rough life. Whitechapel was a slum. It was a disgusting place. It was not the place you wanted to go if you could help it. There was overcrowding. People were sick. Women would just sit out in the streets and beg for food. You know, it was a really rough place. So I don't see Mudgett going up to a toothless wonder who's drunk and in dirty clothing and saying, wow, I want to kill her. I just don't see that. So I'm not convinced there's enough evidence to say, I've got it, Carl. I'm not ready to say that Mudgett was actually the Ripper. I just don't see it, and maybe Jeff can come up with really definitive stuff, but I'm having a little trouble trying to put it all together. I'm going to try to load this song that Carl wants to hear, so just bear with me while I play some more music. Yeah, that was that's Ghost's contribution to the show tonight. That was Jack the Ripper by Screaming Lord Sutch, S-U-T-C-H, Jack the Ripper. I thought it would just be funny to be a little odd, and I played Queen, Somebody to Love. I mean, you know, obviously this guy had his issues. The other one was My Name is Jack, Dear Boss, and I found that on YouTube, and I thought that was just funny as heck. He actually takes one of the letters, the Dear Boss letter, and he narrates it to some hokey music. So I thought that was kind of funny, because it is a grim conversation we're having about a serial killer. In fact, 3. If you tie H.H. Holmes with the Cleveland Torso murders, and then Jack the Ripper, I mean, that would make him the most accomplished serial killer in the history of the world. Nothing stopped this guy. But it all hinges on whether or not Jeff can get that body exhumed. So, and that's going to be a lot of money because you need permits. If the Smithsonian wants the body, then they should have to pay for it. That's the way I'm looking at it. Jeff says he wants to bring closure to families, but I don't know who exactly, other than his own family, that he could bring closure to. You know, because a lot of these victims, they have no idea who they were. They said they could identify 20 of the victims from the murder house, but the bones of children and women and men found in there, the pieces, different pieces, lead them to believe, some people have said, over 200 people were killed in those 2 or 3 years at the Chicago World's Fair Castle of Murder. So that's a lot of people, and he just had a revolving door. He could do whatever he wanted, and he wasn't getting caught. I don't know how the smell didn't permeate up through the rest of the house, though. That kind of throws me. But back then, people still threw their wastewater out into the streets. So I'm going to play music for the rest of the show. The next piece I'm going to play is Christopher Lee. He's always been a bad guy. I love that about him. In his movies, he's always a bad guy. And in 1983, an Australian film crew made a musical comedy about a superhero, and it's called The Return of Captain Invincible. Alan Arkin was Captain Invincible, who during World War II, this is a made-up story, guys, okay? He was saving the world, just like Captain America, but eventually he fell out of favor, and the McCarthyism started investigating him, and they started arresting him for flying around in a red robe and creating a nuisance in the airways. And you know, they were all these ridiculous ideas that, you know, they were trying to put him out of business. And then 30 years later, his old rival, Mr. Midnight, reemerges and steals a secret government superweapon, a hypno-ray. And the U.S. government asks now alcoholic, drunk Captain Invincible to return and follow. The story is about his attempts to redeem his reputation. And this scene is Christopher Lee in a silver spandex jumpsuit, which is disturbing, with 3 chicks that look like goth, dressed up like goth, and this little thing that looks like a young Yoda or something like that from Star Wars. And he's singing that Captain Invincible should pick his poison, or he's going to have to call the boys in. And of course, because it's World War II, that originally these two were archvillain and superhero, Christopher Lee uses a German accent. So I really think you're going to like it. I laugh my rear end off every time I hear it. That's how funny it is. So I hope you guys enjoy it. And then we're going to do Darren Mac the Knife, Taylor Dane, Original Sin. You'll remember that from The Shadow with one of the Baldwin boys, and AC/DC, Hell's Bells. And I hope everybody enjoyed that, because that's the last song for tonight. Next week, we're going to have Michael Snyder on. Michael Snyder has written a book, The Economic Collapse. Are you prepared for the coming economic collapse and the next Great Depression? And I think it's, it's kind of a nightmare vision he's giving us. And I think it's going to be a great show. A lot of information is going to be shared. I hope everybody enjoys it. I hope everybody checks out Jeff's book, Bloodstains, the book. And his Facebook is Bloodstains, the movie. It's going to be made into a movie. Robert Downey, he looks like a sociopath. And I hope everybody enjoys it. So.
Thank you for visiting me at my lair. You can always contact me at www.asylumsgate.com. Again, thank you for visiting, and God bless you and yours.
Was not executed. H.H. Holmes was not executed. There's a very good chance he was involved in the Chicago torso murders, because the idea was the same thing. The only thing is you're talking about a man 70 or older who can't schlep bodies anymore, so he was just dumping them out, where it was convenient. But a lot of people are asking, where is your information? Because you and I both have some questions about him being Jack the Ripper.
That's exactly true. And Mo, let me state to those questioning my story, Bloodstains is a piece of fiction based on the truth that I decided to characterize that way after many meetings with my lawyers. The readers can believe in it or not. I intend to prove almost everything in it eventually. We're going to prove that he was Jack the Ripper. That's coming up pretty soon. We're going to prove that he was never hanged, that the guard was hanged in his place. We're going to prove that his DNA is not in that concrete buried in Pennsylvania. And then we're going to prove to the world where he actually is buried. So if people want to believe that I made that up all myself and then proved it, historically, well, they can if they want, but the story is about the material my grandfather left me after he died in a couple of old fishing tackle boxes, and I described that in the book.
Yeah, there are actually letters or writings from your great-great-grandfather, right, that were in the book.
That's what the story is about, Mo. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you got to help me out here. You got to tell them what you want them to know so they buy the book and read it. Jack the Ripper. Let's talk about Holmes just for a minute. I know we blew 12 minutes when Skype insisted I update, and they're going to get a scathing email from me about that. But he was an entrepreneur. This guy.
The opinions and views expressed in the following presentation do not necessarily reflect those of GCR Progressive Internet Radio Management, staff, or our affiliates.
Toto? I just feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GCR Progressive Internet Radio. We're rocking your world.
So nice and sharp. I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GCR Internet Radio. We're not going to do the usual, banter about what's going on, but I am going to ask for prayers for all the people out near Idlewild, California with those horrid fires. There are a lot of wildfires going on right now, and it's really getting dangerous. And this is what happens when we build houses in areas that are hit by lightning and very dry and that kind of thing. Please pray for everybody at Mother Nature's mercy right now. Extreme weather is hitting all over Europe, third world countries, floods, earthquakes, you name it. Everybody's getting hammered. God bless you all. I love you all. And please say a prayer for everybody. Please remind everybody that animals need shelter. They're not, dogs shouldn't be tied to a tree and left until you remember they're there. Animals need protection from heat. Children need protection from heat. So do old people. Old people tend to think, 100 years ago, I used to sit outside, in 100-degree weather, and they can't do that anymore. So sometimes it's a little, hard to get them, to suck up and come in. I want to welcome all the people in the chat room. I want to welcome people that are listening on the players and will be listening to the recordings of this. God bless you all. Our guest, Jeff Mudgett, is on, and he has written a book called Bloodstains. Jeff has been on before. And we've talked about an ancestor of his. We can't pick our relatives, people. As much as I would like to, sometimes you can't. And he's got a dubious relationship to one of America's most prolific serial killers. And the more that gets unraveled, the more it seems that he did a lot more than just what we think he did. So, Jeff Mudgett, welcome back to the lair.
Hello.
Hello. Now I'm going to try to see if they're hearing you. Are you hearing him in the chat? Somebody let me know. Did you hear Jeff say hello?
Hello. 1, 2, 3.
No sound. Jeff, I think I'm going to have to reschedule because we're already 12 minutes into this. Oh, okay, wait. Yes, they can. Yes, they hear you. That's cool. Okay, so Jeff, let's just pick it up where you were. Your great-great-grandfather was?
My great-great-grandfather's real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but he was known historically as H.H. Holmes, perhaps the most evil man that ever lived, and the first Hitler to be classified as a serial killer by our criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. You were a young middle-aged when you found this out, and your poor grandfather
to escape that stigma, and he'd done a pretty good job running away from the truth of what actually happened in the 1890s, as you described it. So he had done a good job. It was only after this obsession my grandmother had about, the general from Civil War fame, that it all came out. And he stood up. I describe it in the book, Mo. He stood up at the table. I can still see it clear as the day. He slammed his chair back against the wall. His eyes went around the table, and he said, "That name will never be mentioned in my house again." Then he pointed his finger at me and stormed out of the room.
Yeah, I remember that in the book. And then when your grandfather died, somehow you became in possession of a box that belonged to him, and there were artifacts in this box which opened up Pandora's box for you, I'm sure. And I guess anybody who wants to read the book, it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. I mean, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, to have this kind of thing in their family, because I just think it's really rough. But you can find Bloodstains on Amazon, and Jeff has a site, right? What's your site, Jeff?
Yeah, bloodstainsthebook.com, all one word, and you can buy a printed signed copy there. Just let my manager Kelly know that you heard about the book on the show tonight. Mo's a friend of mine, and I'll instruct Kelly to give out signed copies with the order if you'd like.
Oh, thank you so much. The book, you got a box of information, and when I delve into this like I do for each show, I research and all, a lot of people are questioning where is the evidence, because when we were talking last time, I told you that I was, if Mudget had survived, and I'm kind of just blurted it out to you, is because you started asking questions, right, about this at the table during a dinner?
Yeah, roughly so. My grandmother was convinced we were the descendants of General Robert E. Lee. She had hired a genealogical company, quite expensive actually, and with some help from my brother had tracked that down, only to find out that it wasn't true. The professionals tried to let her down easy, Mo, by stating that we were the descendants of a horse thief in Arkansas who had been executed by a rope. Well, at that same dinner table, the questions flew back and forth, and then my grandfather was forced to admit, the entire family, that we were actually the descendants of H. Holmes, a secret he'd kept from even my grandmother, the woman he'd been married to for 60 years.
Yeah, 60 years ago, this was not something you wanted to share with the family and the kiddies, that great-great-grandpa was H. Holmes and had a murder castle in Chicago, and during the World's Fair in 1898 was killing people. It tends to make everybody think, what the hell, And the stigma. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer's family, for crying out loud, what they're going through. So I can't imagine how he just kept this to himself and hoped, I guess, you'd never find out.
Yeah, back then, Mo, the family, the stigma, you coined it exactly correct. Back then, people believed in the devil. I guess it's coming back around these days even, but back then, the turn of the century, the devil was believed in. There were many articles by the New York Times trying to characterize Holmes as the devil, an evil being different from most other human beings. My grandfather and the family moved west out to California